Deep in the shadowed hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the trees clutched at the sky like gnarled fingers and the mist hung low like a shroud over forgotten graves, the old Whittaker homestead crouched in silence. It was the kind of place where the wind whispered through the pines, carrying echoes that weren't quite right, voices, some said, murmuring secrets from the undergrowth after dusk. The year was 1971, and the air that October evening tasted of damp earth and something sharper, like the metallic tang of blood. Sarah May, barely 17, lay in the dim flicker of kerosene lamps inside the ramshackle cabin, her body twisted in agony as the family gathered around her like sentinels. They were a clan bound by blood in ways the outside world could scarcely fathom, generations woven together in a deliberate tangle, their faces bearing the same hollow eyes and uneven features, as if the hills themselves had shaped them from the same flawed clay. No one spoke of calling for help, outsiders were poison, their judgments a threat to the sacred rotation that had guided pairings since the ancestors first claimed this land. But as Sarah's cries grew ragged, splintering the night, her kin exchanged glances heavy with anticipation. This birth, they believed, was different, the fulfillment of a long-whispered promise. Little did they know that what emerged into the flickering light would unravel the fragile veil between their isolated world and the prying eyes of a nation, setting loose echoes that would linger in the dark woods for decades, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. In the dim glow of a cluttered home office in Charleston, West Virginia, investigative journalist Elias Crow sat hunched over his laptop late one autumn evening in 2025, sifting through a fresh batch of Freedom of Information Act responses that had landed in his inbox like ghosts from a forgotten era. Elias had spent years chasing stories of hidden Appalachian tragedies, mine disasters, opioid shadows, families swallowed by poverty, but nothing prepared him for the thin, yellowed scans that materialized on his screen. These were declassified medical and social services files from the early 1970s, marked with faded stamps of confidentiality now lifted after decades in dusty archives. The documents referenced a remote community in Raleigh County, a place called Odd, where a bizarre medical incident had unfolded in the fall of 1971 involving a teenage girl from a reclusive clan known locally as the Whittakers. The files were fragmented, redacted in places, but what remained painted a chilling picture. Frantic emergency calls from a rural hospital describing a birth gone catastrophically wrong, anomalies that defied standard medical explanation, and hurried interventions by state authorities who swooped in to contain what they termed a potential public health crisis. Phrases jumped out at Elias: severe congenital deformities, suspected consanguinity extending multiple generations, family resistance to external involvement, hinting at a deliberate pattern of inbreeding that had culminated in something so profound it warranted government scrutiny. One memo, dated November 1971, noted the infant's swift removal from the family's custody amid fears of broader genetic implications for the isolated hollow where they lived, a place cut off by winding dirt roads and thick forests that seemed to guard their secrets fiercely. Elias leaned back, the room growing colder as the wind rattled the windows, his mind racing with questions. Why had these records been buried for over 50 years? What exactly had emerged that night in the flickering light of a backwoods cabin, forcing outsiders to breach the clan's impenetrable isolation? The Whittakers were whispered about in local lore, a family bound by blood ties tighter than most dared imagine, their features marked by the hill's unforgiving legacy, but these papers suggested something darker, a long-buried event that had shocked even hardened officials. As he cross-referenced names and dates, tracing the lineage back through census records and old birth certificates, Elias felt an uneasy pull, the kind that warned of venturing too deep into shadows where the trees themselves seemed to watch and wait. The more he read, the more the fragments coalesced into a narrative of deliberate seclusion, pairings orchestrated across generations to preserve what the family viewed as purity, or perhaps a misguided bid for strength in a world that had long marginalized them. Yet the 1971 case stood apart, flagged as the tipping point where nature's cruel reckoning could no longer be hidden from prying eyes. Elias bookmarked the files, his pulse quickening with the thrill of discovery laced with dread, knowing this thread, once pulled, might unravel far more than a single night's horror. It could expose echoes still lingering in those mist-shrouded woods, voices carried on the breeze that no amount of time had fully silenced. Elias Crow eased his rented sedan down the cracked asphalt that twisted like a serpent through Raleigh County, the interstate fading into memory as the road narrowed into a ribbon of gravel flanked by impenetrable walls of rhododendron and hemlock. It was late afternoon when he finally reached the scattering of weathered homes that passed for the community of Odd, a place so unassuming it barely registered on maps, tucked along the murmuring flow of Tommy Creek where the hills rose steep and unforgiving. The air grew thicker here, heavy with the scent of damp leaves and coal dust carried on the breeze, and the light filtered through the canopy in fractured shafts that danced uneasily across the windshield. He pulled over near a faded general store, its porch sagging under the weight of forgotten years, and stepped out into the hush that seemed to swallow sound whole. A handful of locals lingered nearby, an older man in overalls rocking on a bench, a woman hanging laundry that fluttered like pale ghosts, and their eyes tracked him with the quiet wariness reserved for strangers who ventured too far off the beaten path. Elias approached cautiously, notebook in hand, introducing himself as a writer researching old Appalachian stories, but the responses came clipped and guarded, voices dropping to murmurs as they glanced toward the denser woods that crowded the edges of the settlement. One elderly man, his face etched deep as the bark on the ancient oaks, finally spoke after a long pull on his pipe, warning that some tales were best left buried, especially those tied to the reclusive clan up the hollow whose blood ran too close for comfort across generations. He spoke of unnatural sounds drifting from the forest after sunset, low murmurs that weren't quite wind or wildlife, voices threading through the pines like threads of an old curse woven into the land itself since the days when mining camps dotted these hills and families turned inward against the world's harsh judgments. Outsiders, the man said with a sidelong glance, stirred things better left sleeping, inviting echoes that clung to the mist and followed you home. Others nodded subtly, sharing fragments of lore about forbidden pairings that twisted the Whittaker line into something the hills both protected and punished, their features marked by the same shadowed eyes and silent communications that set them apart. A woman muttered about how the woods held grudges, carrying whispers of long-ago sins, curses murmured over cradles or graves, that manifested in the eerie calls heard on moonless nights, drawing the unwary deeper into thickets where paths vanished and orientation failed. Elias pressed gently for directions to the old homestead, but heads shook, advice laced with urgency to turn back before dusk claimed the ridges, lest he hear his own name carried on that unnatural breeze, a lure from something ancient and unbound lurking just beyond the tree line. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to reach with finger-like branches, Elias felt the weight of their stares pressing him toward retreat, the community's silence a shield around secrets that had festered for decades in isolation. Yet the pull of those declassified files gnawed at him, urging him onward despite the chill settling into his bones, the sense that the dense forest ahead guarded more than overgrown trails, it harbored murmurs of a bloodline's dark legacy, waiting in the gathering gloom for fresh ears to listen. Under the cover of a moonless night 2 days later, Elias Crow parked his car a mile from the agreed spot, an abandoned churchyard on the outskirts of Odd where crumbling headstones leaned like weary sentinels amid overgrown weeds. The air carried the sharp bite of impending frost, and the only sound was the distant hoot of an owl echoing through the hollows as he waited, flashlight dimmed in his pocket. A figure emerged from the tree line at the stroke of midnight, moving with the cautious shuffle of someone long accustomed to avoiding notice. Evelyn Harper, the retired nurse whose name had surfaced in the redacted margins of those 1971 files, now in her late 80s, her frame frail beneath a threadbare coat but her eyes sharp as winter steel. She had agreed to meet only after cryptic phone exchanges, her voice trembling over the line with warnings that some memories clawed their way back if spoken aloud. Elias guided her to a weathered bench beneath the church's sagging eaves, the wood creaking under their weight as she settled, clutching a faded handbag like a shield. For a long moment she stared into the darkness, as if listening for pursuit, before beginning in a hushed whisper that barely rose above the rustle of dead leaves. She had been a young midwife then, fresh from training, assigned to the understaffed rural hospital in Beckley where the Whittaker girl had been brought against the family's fierce protests. Sarah May, pale and sweating on a gurney, her labor advanced far beyond what home remedies could manage. Evelyn's hands shook as she recounted the delivery room that night, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that buzzed like trapped insects, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and antiseptic. The family had hovered outside the doors at first, their faces pressed to the small windows, murmuring in low, rhythmic tones that unsettled the staff. But as complications mounted, Sarah's screams fracturing into something primal, the boundaries blurred in ways Evelyn could scarcely articulate even now. The infant that finally emerged, slick and silent at first, bore marks that defied the textbooks, features exaggerated in unnatural symmetry, eyes that seemed to hold an ancient knowing, limbs twisted in configurations that whispered of genetic reckonings accumulated over untold generations. She paused often, glancing over her shoulder into the void, describing how the room had grown colder despite the heaters, shadows lengthening as if the walls themselves recoiled. The doctor had faltered, instruments clattering, while Evelyn held the child, feeling an inexplicable pull, a sense that what cradled in her arms straddled the line between human frailty and something older, unbound by the laws of flesh. The family's chants had swelled then, filtering through the doors like a dark liturgy, until authorities arrived to whisk the newborn away, sealing records and silencing witnesses with veiled threats of professional ruin. Tears traced the deep lines of her face as she spoke of nightmares that followed, visions of the woods claiming what was taken, murmurs in the wind carrying fragmented pleas. Elias listened in the chilling hush, the weight of her words settling like fog, revealing fractures in reality that the official files only hinted at, memories fragmented yet vivid, pulling him inexorably toward the heart of the hollow where the truth still breathed in the undergrowth. The morning after his clandestine meeting with Evelyn Harper, Elias Crow slipped away from the wary eyes of Odd's residents, following a faint deer path that branched off the gravel road and plunged into the dense forest encircling the Whittaker homestead. The canopy closed overhead like a living vault, filtering the pale December sunlight into fractured gleams that barely reached the moss-covered ground, where decades of fallen leaves muffled his footsteps into near silence. He carried only a small pack, notebook, recorder, flashlight, and a hand-drawn map sketched from old county surveys, marking the approximate location of the family's original holdings deep in the hollow. As he pressed onward, the terrain grew wilder, rhododendrons twisting into impenetrable thickets that forced him to detour around walls of green, the air growing cooler and heavier with the scent of decay and evergreen resin. Hours passed before the first signs emerged, faint remnants of human passage, a rusted nail here, a shard of porcelain there, half buried in the undergrowth as if the woods had slowly reclaimed what once stood proud. Then the ruins appeared, overgrown foundations of long-collapsed outbuildings, stones mossed over and vines threading through cracks like veins, the skeletal frames of what might have been smokehouses or barns sagging into the earth. Elias paused at one such site, brushing aside layers of leaf litter to reveal weathered timbers etched with peculiar markers, crude symbols gouged deep into the bark of surrounding trees, spirals and interlocking lines that seemed deliberate yet archaic, not the casual carvings of idle hands but something ritualistic, repeated at intervals along what had once been a cleared perimeter. The marks caught the shifting light oddly, shadows playing across them in ways that made the patterns appear to writhe when viewed from the corner of the eye, deepening as the sun dipped lower and the mist began to rise from the hollow floor. Deeper still, he stumbled upon more enigmatic traces, flat stones arranged in subtle patterns half swallowed by ferns, and on the trunks of ancient oaks, fresh scratches beneath the old, as if the carvings were maintained, renewed by unseen hands even now. The forest here felt different, thicker, the branches lower and more tangled, light fading prematurely into a twilight gloom where details blurred and distances deceived. Elias traced one symbol with gloved fingers, feeling the rough edges, wondering at their purpose, wards against outsiders, perhaps, or guides for those who knew the blood-bound paths. The air grew still, unnaturally so, no bird calls or squirrel chatter piercing the hush, only the faint drip of condensation from leaves overhead. As he photographed the markers, noting how some seemed to align toward the heart of the hollow, a chill unrelated to the winter cold settled over him, the sense that these weren't mere relics but active sentinels, etched to contain or summon something that lingered in the soil and shadows of this forsaken ground. As twilight bled into full darkness on that December night, Elias Crow returned to the forest's edge, drawn by an compulsion he could neither name nor resist, his flashlight's narrow beam slicing through the inky void like a fragile lifeline. The air had turned biting, frost rhyming the underbrush, and the path he followed, marked faintly by those peculiar carvings, seemed to narrow deliberately, branches clawing at his coat as if urging retreat. He had waited until the last lights in Odd flickered out, slipping past the homestead's distant silhouettes where dogs barked once, then fell silent, before plunging deeper into the hollow than daylight had allowed. The world beyond the beam shrank to a tunnel of gnarled trunks and shifting shadows, the ground uneven beneath boots that crunched softly on frozen leaves, each step echoing too loudly in the oppressive hush. Hours melted away as he navigated by instinct and the occasional symbol glowing faintly in the flashlight's glow, the mist rising from the earth to swirl around his ankles like spectral fingers. Fatigue tugged at him, but curiosity burned hotter, Evelyn's fragmented recollections fueling visions of what might linger here, unbound by the grave or the confines of official records. Then it began, not abruptly, but as a subtle shift in the silence, a murmur threading through the pines so low it might have been the wind playing tricks. Elias froze, sweeping the light in slow arcs, illuminating only empty thickets and dew-laden ferns that glistened like eyes in the dark. The sound came again, closer, indistinct words overlapping in a chorus too harmonious for nature, sibilant whispers that carried an eerie familiarity, syllables half-formed yet tugging at memory, as if spoken in a tongue known in dreams. His breath clouded the air as he pressed forward, the voices seeming to recede just ahead, luring him off the faint trail into denser undergrowth where brambles snagged and low branches whipped across his face. The murmurs grew layered, some rising in pitch like a child's plea, others deep and resonant, weaving together in patterns that mimicked conversation yet dissolved when focused upon. Heart pounding, Elias felt drawn inexorably deeper, the flashlight trembling in his grip, revealing glimpses of movement in the periphery, shadows detaching from trees only to vanish when illuminated. The whispers encircled him now, brushing against his ears with intimate urgency, carrying fragments that sounded almost like names, his own among them, pulling him toward a clearing he sensed more than saw, where the darkness felt thicker, alive with anticipation. Guided by the persistent murmurs that seemed to fade just beyond reach, Elias Crow pushed through a final wall of tangled vines into a small clearing where the remnants of an abandoned shack huddled against the encroaching forest, its roof half collapsed and walls bowed under the weight of time and neglect. The structure had evaded his earlier searches, concealed by overgrowth that parted almost reluctantly as he approached, the whispers falling silent the moment his hand touched the splintered door frame. Moonlight filtered weakly through gaps in the boards, illuminating dust motes that hung motionless in the stale air as he stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath him like a warning unheeded. The interior was a frozen tableau of abandonment, rotted furniture overturned, cobwebs veiling broken windows, and scattered across a warped table and the dirt floor lay yellowed papers, brittle journals, and ledgers that had somehow survived decades of damp and decay. Elias knelt carefully, his flashlight revealing pages filled with meticulous handwriting in faded ink, entries spanning generations in a script that grew more erratic over time. At the center lay a thick bound volume, its leather cover cracked and embossed with faint symbols matching those carved on the surrounding trees, pages crammed with diagrams of family lineage, intricate trees branching and reconnecting in patterns that defied conventional genealogy. As he turned the fragile sheets, the truth emerged in cold, deliberate detail. A rotation system documented with clinical precision, pairings orchestrated across cousins, siblings, and closer kin to concentrate bloodlines in pursuit of what the writer called genetic perfection, a misguided quest for resilience against the hardships that had claimed so many in these isolated hills. Names repeated in calculated cycles, notes margin scrawled with observations of traits strengthened or flaws amplified, births logged alongside cryptic annotations about signs and omens interpreted as progress toward an ultimate convergence. Deeper entries revealed the system's culmination in the 1970s, focusing on Sarah May's pregnancy as the apex of centuries-long effort, expected to yield an heir unbound by the weaknesses that plagued prior generations, features refined to unnatural acuity, vitality drawn from the deepest wells of shared ancestry. The records spoke of rituals accompanying conceptions, herbs gathered under specific moons, and a fervent belief that the hollow's ancient energies would bless the endeavor, purging frailty in favor of something purer, more enduring. Elias traced the lines with growing unease, the shack's shadows deepening as if the walls absorbed the light, the air thick with the scent of moldering paper and earth that felt disturbingly alive. As Elias carefully turned the final pages of the leather-bound ledger under the faltering beam of his flashlight, the entries converged on the night of October 1971, detailing with reverent precision how Sarah May's labor marked the culmination of the family's centuries-old rotation system, an intricate web of unions designed to distill their bloodline into something transcendent, free from the frailties that had thinned their numbers amid the harsh Appalachian isolation. The writer, an elder whose script trembled with excitement, described the pregnancy as the promised apex, a child conceived under aligned omens, nurtured with ancient remedies, expected to embody impossible vitality and perception, a harbinger whose arrival would elevate the clan beyond mere survival into a state of perfected kinship with the land itself. Cross-referencing with Evelyn's whispered account, Elias pieced together the chaos that unfolded in the Beckley Hospital delivery room, where the infant emerged not with the frail cries typical of such burdened lineages but in eerie silence, its form revealing anomalies that blurred the line between tragic deformity and deliberate evolution, limbs elongated in unnatural proportion, skin translucent over veins that pulsed with uncanny rhythm, eyes opening immediately to fix upon those present. With a gaze too knowing, too ancient for a newborn's fragile skull. The family, gathered in defiant vigil outside, had erupted into ecstatic murmurs, interpreting the child's features as the fulfillment of their twisted prophecy, a living testament to the system's success rather than its cruel failure. Yet the medical staff recoiled, the room descending into pandemonium as monitors faltered and shadows seemed to thicken without cause, the air charged with a presence that made instruments slip from gloved hands. State authorities, alerted by frantic calls framing the birth as a public health emergency, arrived swiftly in unmarked vehicles, their faces grim beneath fedora brims as they navigated the rural corridors, documents in hand authorizing immediate seizure amid fears of contagion or broader genetic implications that could not be contained in one hollow. The infant was whisked into isolation, records hastily sealed, while the Whittakers raged against the intrusion, their chants echoing down hallways like a curse unleashed. The ledger's last entry mourned the theft yet clung to fervent belief that the child, revered as the harbinger, had transcended mortal confines, its essence unbound by the outsider's interference. Back at his rented cabin on the outskirts of Odd, Elias Crow spread the photographed pages of the ledger across the scarred wooden table, the shack's revelations still clinging to him like damp earth as he cross-referenced official records that claimed the 1971 infant had succumbed swiftly in state custody, its anomalies deemed incompatible with life, body interred in an unmarked grave far from the hollow. Yet doubt gnawed deeper with each passing hour, the family's fervent entries insisting the harbinger's essence had transcended flesh, unbound by the outsider's crude interventions. That first night alone, subtle disturbances began, his notebook sliding inches across the surface without touch, pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breath, the room's single bulb flickering in rhythms that matched no electrical fault. Elias dismissed it as fatigue at first, the wind rattling loose panes, but the occurrences escalated, keys tumbling from hooks, chair legs scraping floorboards in slow, deliberate drags, always when his back turned or gaze averted, accompanied by a faint chill that raised gooseflesh despite the roaring fire. Venturing out at dawn to clear his head along the forest fringe, the whispers returned stronger, no longer indistinct but synchronized overlays threading through the mist, murmuring fragments of lullabies twisted into something plaintive, almost accusatory. Objects in his pack shifted inexplicably during rests, a water bottle rolling uphill on sloped ground, the recorder activating on its own to capture bursts of static laced with childlike sighs. By the second evening, the phenomena intensified inside the cabin, glasses tipping to spill in perfect arcs, shadows detaching from walls to coalesce in corners before dissolving, all synchronized with swells in the distant voices that now seemed to emanate from within the wood itself, pressing against windows like fingers testing glass. Elias realized with mounting dread that the child declared perished in sanitized reports had not truly departed, its presence lingering as a restless imprint tied indelibly to the woods and bloodline, manifesting through these inexplicable movements and choral echoes that grew more insistent with his proximity to the truth. The disturbances felt directed, almost communicative, objects rearranging into crude patterns mimicking the ledger's symbols, whispers sharpening into pleas that tugged at consciousness, suggesting a survival beyond mortal limits, an entity neither fully gone nor contained. Driven by the escalating disturbances that now rattled the cabin's windows with unseen knocks, Elias Crow approached the weathered Whittaker homestead under a steel-gray sky, the porch sagging beneath clusters of silent figures who watched his advance with eyes reflecting the same shadowed hollows, features echoing across generations in subtle, unsettling repetition. Dogs growled low from chains, then whimpered into submission as he climbed the uneven steps, the air thick with wood smoke and the faint, acrid tang of isolation that clung to everything. An elder emerged from the doorway, his frame gaunt yet unyielding, face a map of deep furrows, an intent stare that pierced without blinking, flanked by others who gathered in quiet formation, men and women bearing the unmistakable stamp of shared lineage, postures protective, murmurs exchanged in tones too low for outsiders to parse. Elias introduced himself cautiously, ledger photographs in hand, speaking of the 1971 birth and the records unearthed, but the elder's expression hardened, a flicker of recognition betraying decades of guarded secrecy. They invited him inside with reluctant gestures, the interior dim and cluttered with relics of self-sufficiency, jars lining shelves, hand-hewn furniture scarred by time, where the family closed ranks around a central table, their unyielding belief spilling forth in measured words laced with conviction. The rotation system, they affirmed without shame, had been a sacred covenant, pairings guided by necessity and vision to forge strength from the hill's unforgiving soil, culminating in the harbinger whose anomalies proved divine favor rather than curse. Yet woven into their defense were chilling hints of external orchestration, whispers of distant kin or shadowy visitors long ago who encouraged the inward turn, providing subtle incentives or knowledge that steered the bloodline toward its apex. Forces perhaps tied to old mining interests or forgotten experiments seeking resilience in human stock. The family clung to faith in the experiment's triumph, the child's essence enduring despite seizure, manifestations in the woods a sign of watchful return. Elias pressed for clarity on those influences, sensing layers beneath their devotion, but eyes narrowed collectively, the room growing heavier as if the walls themselves leaned in, their loyalty absolute to the legacy and whatever unseen hands had shaped it in the heart of the hollow on the final midnight of his investigation. Elias Crow stood alone amid the ancient oaks where the carvings converged, the air unnaturally still as frost etched delicate patterns on the bark and the mist coiled thicker than ever, swallowing the stars overhead. The disturbances had peaked since his confrontation with the family objects hurling themselves in the cabin, shadows twisting into impossible shapes, driving him back to this forsaken clearing where the whispers had first ensnared him, their pull now irresistible, a chorus swelling from every direction with urgent intensity. He extinguished his flashlight, surrendering to the darkness, and the voices responded immediately, no longer fragmented murmurs but harmonizing into clarity, layering upon one another in a symphony that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. Words emerged distinct at last, woven from childlike tones and deeper resonances, recounting fragments of the ledger's prophecy, the harbinger's birth, the seizure, the enduring bond yet laced with revelations that chilled deeper than the winter night. The chorus sharpened, coalescing around a single, insistent message that repeated with growing fervor, naming bloodlines long buried, tracing connections through forgotten branches of his own genealogy researched hastily in archives days prior. Elias staggered as the implications struck, distant ties to the Whittaker clan, perhaps through a wandering ancestor who ventured into these hills generations ago, threads manipulated by those shadowy external forces the family hinted at, drawing him here not by chance but design. The mist swirled violently then, voices merging into a unified plea or command implicating him fully in the lineage, revealing his arrival as the final piece in the rotation's unfinished cycle, his outsider's perspective a deliberate lure to either expose the mystery to the world or succumb, joining the eternal watch within the woods. Shadows detached from trees, forming ephemeral silhouettes that encircled him, features flickering with the harbinger's anomalous gaze, pressing the impossible choice: publish the truth and shatter the veil, risking the entity's unbound release, or silence it forever, becoming guardian and prisoner alike in the hollow's timeless embrace. The voices crescendoed, the air electric with anticipation, forcing Elias to confront the precipice where revelation and damnation blurred.